Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I am here to do a review. So the book that I'm going to be reviewing for you today in a non-spoilery fashion is We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. This is a new release from Nina LaCour. It came out on February 14th, and Penguin was so nice they sent this along to me early, unsolicited, so cannot wait to talk about this more. I'm going to set it just down here and we can start talking about what this book is about and what I thought of it. We Are Okay follows our main character, Marin. She spent her whole life in California with her grandfather who has raised her, but now the book begins and she is at school in New York. As it turns out, her grandfather has passed away and she is deep in the midst of trying to process a lot of these feelings. And while she was trying to deal with all of this, she ran away from everything that she knew back at home, including her best friend, Mabel. And now the book has begun. It is the first winter break of her first semester at college. The entire campus is empty and she is waiting for Mabel to arrive because now she's finally going to have to face some of the grief and the confusion that she left behind the summer before. So I have a lot of feelings about this book, and some of them are really good, some of them are kind of in the middle, and I want to talk about all of them, but first and foremost, I want to say that this book did an excellent job exploring grief. It explored and processed that emotion so well, and Nina LaCour crafts such a beautiful narrative around Marin trying to deal with the emotions that she has, along with all of the other emotions that are heightened because of it. The entire book feels incredibly raw, and Nina LaCour does an incredible job of exploring all of the complexities of grief and how all of those make Marin who she is in this book. I want to recommend it for people who've experienced that level of grief because I think that this book does such an incredible job of depicting it, but I also want to say that because this book is so raw, I can see how it would be difficult to read it as well. But just speaking as me, I was incredibly impressed by the ways that Nina LaCour examined this feeling and the ways that the main character dealt with it from beginning to end of the story. So besides that, let's talk about a few more of my varied opinions. I think that the first half of this book was okay, if you'll excuse the wordplay. It was pretty good, and it did a good job of exploring grief while not doing a lot of other things quite as well. However, the last half, maybe the last 1/4 or so, was beautifully written, and it almost made me change my rating. I had been considering giving it a 3.5, and then the ending happened, and I really wanted to nudge up my rating. Sadly, I think that the middle being the quality that it was, I couldn't nudge it up that last 0.5 stars, but this is just to say that the ending is beautifully written and does such a good job of finishing off the story. I'll talk a little bit more later about why I wasn't as big a fan of the middle and beginning portions of the book. But first, I want to talk about the writing because it was so lonely and melancholy and just aching. This is my third Nina LaCour book, and she remains to have such evocative language and prose, and I'm always impressed by it. And the setting, the entire book takes place over a couple of days in this college campus where Marin and Mabel are the only two people, and the isolation of that setting emphasized the isolation of the writing so beautifully. It was obviously intended, but the ways that the isolation in the writing and in the setting really complemented each other to give us a real idea of how Marin was feeling and thinking, it was just done perfectly. This is sort of a small thing, but personal to me, and this is why it worked. But Marin grew up in the West, and then she moved to go to college in the East, and that's just the experience that I've had. I grew up out west, and I've gone to New Jersey to go to school. So some of the things that were done with that, the little mentions where Marin and Mabel don't know one of the chains that's over here, or just little things like that, made it feel really authentic. And it was an experience I identified with really strongly. So personally a huge fan of how that was done, even if it was a pretty small thread throughout the book. So let's talk about the diversity of this book, because when it hadn't come out yet, I was having a hard time figuring out whether or not it was going to feature a queer main character. It's just something I know about Nina LaCour, considering that both of the other two books that I've read by her feature queer female lead characters. This does too. The main character of the story is queer. We do not get an identifying label for her, whether she is lesbian or bisexual or anything like that, but she does experience attraction to women. Her best friend Mabel is also queer. She has also experienced attraction to women, at least in the past, and again, she does not get a label either. Plus, Mabel is Latinx, both of her parents are from Mexico, and all of that was just incorporated so seamlessly into Mabel's character. I loved the way that Mabel was written. I loved her parents. They were so incredible. And overall, I was a real fan of the diversity in this book. Mostly because it was so obvious it was diverse without ever being about each of those things. It wasn't about Marin being queer. It was about a queer woman examining grief. And if you've watched this channel before ever, you know that that is the kind of thing I am about. You never have a long conversation with Mabel about her history or her identity because we are in the mind of Marin and what she's dealing with. But at the same time, the book does not let you ignore Mabel and her identity. You know that Mabel is Latinx and you see how that is incorporated into her daily life. And it was just done in a really fabulous way, as well as the way that queerness was explored. In general, like I said, just a huge fan of the diversity in this book that I think was done incredibly well. So let me talk a little bit more about why the first half of this book or so was less my favorite. So as I've said a couple of times in this review so far, this is my third Nina LaCour book, and the reason that I think I noticed my problem in this book is because it's my third book by her, and I've begun to see a pattern. Her writing is just beautiful, but her plots are where she suffers. This book doesn't have much of a plot, it's sort of just about emotion, but the plot elements that happen are where I get frustrated. And the reason I get frustrated is because the things that happen in her books just don't happen, and it's not, I don't really like to put a label on things to declare if they are realistic or unrealistic, but there are just interactions that people have in her books that come across as so reaching in a way that will motivate her characters forward, even if that would never ever happen. And sadly, those moments where the realism ends, they really yank me out of the story. All of a sudden, I'm like, who would ever say this to this complete stranger in real life? And I get so annoyed because her writing is incredible, but I think that her beautiful writing sometimes is there to bolster up a more weak plot, and that's where I get frustrated with Nina LaCour. That's my little rant on that. There were just a lot of moments in the first half of this book where they would have a conversation with someone who would impart some advice about life that didn't make much sense, like a taxi driver doesn't just become an imparter of life wisdom. Also, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, I think it's kind of obvious that Nina LaCour used to be a high school English teacher for a lot of reasons, but mostly there are a lot of comparisons drawn by the main character to some of her favorite books like Jane Eyre and 100 Years of Solitude, and they're just like these textual analyses that I feel like I did in high school or that I did in college, and sometimes those come across as a little bit silly because she is in high school for some of the book, but I'm totally fine with overlooking that. I know it's a novel, and so those little parallels work, but it felt very obvious at times that Nina LaCour used to teach high school English. But overall, let's bring this all back around to say that I really did enjoy a lot about this book, and it took me on an emotional journey. I cried multiple times reading this book, and I think the last 10 pages or so I just spent like crying a little bit and then crying a lot of it. It had some beautiful lines, it had some funny lines, and it just had a lot to offer. So while I had a couple of problems, this is still a book that I highly recommend and will definitely be recommending more on my channel. I wound up giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars, but I super enjoyed it overall, and I think that it's worth the read. Strong emotion, a sort of weak plot, but an incredible stuck landing. Those are my feelings about We Are Okay. So there you go, guys. That is my review of We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. I hope that you enjoyed watching and hearing more of my thoughts about this one. Just so you know, I didn't mention this, but it is a super short book. I got through it in 2 sittings. You could probably get through it in that, or even in 1 sitting, so that's another plus. But I hope that you enjoyed hearing my thoughts about this. If you wanted to share your thoughts, if you've read the book, please leave them below. If you have questions about the book, comment that as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!